Hello and welcome back to the course Private Pilot Maneuvers. Today we'll talk about another abnormal situation. We'll talk about failures of the electrical system. Now there can be a variety of malfunctions, of course. A common one, for example, is alternator failure. So then your battery will be the last source of electricity, of electrical power. Depending on the battery and the charging level and so on, and also the consumers that you keep switched on, it may last roughly 30 minutes in most airplanes. But then again, if you use a lot of consumers, it will be that quicker. The only good thing about normally aspirated conventional piston engines with magneto ignition, like we have in our trainer airplanes, is that an electrical failure will normally not affect the engine operation, so the engine will still keep running. That also means that you have time. Normally, electrical failures are not time critical, so you really have the time to get out the checklist and do it step by step. Of course, an electrical failure might not be that critical during day VFR flight, but it can be a really critical situation during night flight or IFR flight in instrument meteorological conditions. As I've said, there are different types of electrical failures. For example, you could have a single failure of one specific piece of equipment. You could also have a complete electrical failure, so simply everything goes dark. It's always a good idea, if some electrical equipment is malfunctioning, to have a look at the appropriate circuit breaker. Maybe it has popped out. Now, if you do not need that equipment badly, then I suggest leave the circuit breaker out, because there was a reason that it popped out in the first place, and just continue your flight and have the problem sorted out on the ground. If you really think you need this specific equipment, then you can try a circuit breaker reset once, but if it then pops out again, really leave it alone. Generally, for the electrical failures, apply the pilot's operating handbook procedure, if there is one. For example, in the Cessna 152, there is one electrical failure checklist called ammeter excessive rate of charge. So you have an excessive rate of charge on the altimeter. Now, the procedure for that is, for example, to switch the alternator off, pull the alternator circuit breaker, switch off any non-essential equipment, and then land as soon as practical. Another problem you could have is the low voltage light. This can often be caused on the ground due to low RPM, for example, during parking or low RPM taxi. If you increase the RPM a little bit, it should go out. If it doesn't go out on the ground, when you apply higher RPM, then there's something really wrong and you should have it checked out. If it happens during flight, the procedure is to switch off the radios, check the circuit breakers of the alternator, and then switch the master switch off and back on, hoping that you can reset the alternator maybe, and check if the low voltage light is off. If it is off, very good, then just continue your flight and switch on the radios again. But if it remains on, switch off the alternator and switch off any unnecessary consumers and land as soon as possible. Another more dangerous type of electrical failure is an actual electrical fire. Normally, you can recognize this by a very typical smell of insulation, of burning insulation, burning cables. First of all, you should switch off the master switch. Normally, this should then stop the smoke, actually. And then, if you do not need any electrical consumers for the remainder of the flight, just leave the master switch off and land at an uncontrolled airport, for example. If you need electrical power briefly, for example, to do a radio call or to extend the flaps, then the procedure would be to switch off all equipment individually, and then switch the master switch back on, and then one by one switch on the equipment you need. And if then the smoke comes back, switch off that respective equipment, so you might be able to insulate this equipment. However, having a fire or fumes on an airplane is always a very critical situation. So in any case, you should land as soon as possible. If the fire cannot be controlled, it might even be advisable to land right there. So do a precautionary landing to a field just below you, because as soon as the fire gets out of control, there may be severe structural damage really quickly. Also, of course, the fumes and the smoke will affect you and all the people in the cabin. For example, in the Cessna 152, the procedure for an electrical fire is master switch off, all switches off, close the vents and the cabin air and the heat. Use the fire extinguisher if required, but if you do, you have to ventilate the cabin afterwards. All right, so with all these procedures, it's just important that you know what to do from the pilot's operating handbook. So be sure to study this. And if it's not time critical in flight, take your time, take out the checklist and do it step by step. But for any time critical stuff like fire, you should know the things by heart. All right, so this concludes the briefing about electrical failures, and I'll see you next time.